In this lecture, we're going to be continuing our discussion about human behavior in the built environment. In Unit 4, this is the lecture about architectural determinism, and we're going to be talking about how architecture impacts behavior and how our environment can start to affect the ways in which we interact with buildings, the way we interact with each other, and some ways in which we tend to behave. So what is determinism? When we talk about architectural determinism, we're really talking about how our environment dictates and shapes our behavior. Because often we're talking about the inverse, where we're talking about how our behavior or how we perceive things, or things that we tend to want to design, how that impacts the environment around us. But if we look at the way in which our built environment shapes us as people and as a culture, then that's determinism. It's basically that your environment determines your behavior. Now, this really tends to vary between countries, cultures, different types of people. It can vary by age, gender, race. All different kinds of things affect how our behavior is shaped by our environment. But when we're talking about architectural determinism, it's really talking about how your physical environment, the built environment, and the architecture around you shapes your behavior. Well, so what exactly are we talking about? It could be something as simple as if something is painted a certain color and we have either a psychological reaction to that or a physiological reaction to that, and it causes us to behave in a way that's different than if the room were painted another color, then that's architectural determinism, where if you have a variable and you change that, or if you don't have a variable necessarily, but if that component of architecture is affecting the way in which you behave, then you're starting to become affected by that. Now, this can be positive or it can be negative. And so the reason why we talk about this is because, when we're starting to affect change in our environment, or you think about designing something, you want to know the ways in which people are impacted by it. In other lectures, we've talked about how architecture is not just a standalone entity. It's not just an art form or piece of sculpture, but it's something that people inhabit. So we're really talking about, what is its impact on people? And if it begins to change and affect behavior, then, we're hoping that it has a positive impact, or it changes and affects people for good. Now, there can be negative ramifications of determinism. Sometimes those are unintended, sometimes those are intended. If we look at prisons or forms of incarceration, sometimes those are meant to be kind of negative reinforcements of architectural determinism, where either your, punishment or consequences of some action is linked to being put in an environment that you will either respond negatively to, or that is less than ideal compared to what you would like to be experiencing in your environment. Now, usually on the design side for architects, we're trying to analyze all these options so that determinism has a positive impact on behavior, so that for example, if you're designing a school, that you provide natural light so that children perform better, or that their behavior is better, or you have a hospital, then you want to have adequate lighting so that whoever's performing surgery is able to do the best possible job. And so it can be simple things like that, but we want to look at how the environment itself begins to impact behavior. Now, human behavior is, often studied, and it's often mysterious as well. So, we're trying to look for this link in architecture between physical environments and behavior itself. And so this is kind of a cartoonish drawing of a an urban structure, and looking at how people are affected by their environment, and when people start to live in close proximity to one another, how do they start to behave? Do they start to write on the walls? Do they start to identify with their particular portion of a built environment? How do they evolve and grow based on the environment they're put in? And people often look at architecture in terms of the indoor-outdoor impact. How much fresh air do you get? How much green space do you have? That typically has an impact on your life, on your behavior, on your physical and psychological well-being. There are often studies and research done on if people can look outside from inside. If they don't have a connection with even a window or a view to the outside, how that impacts their behavior, how that impacts their work day or their school day, and how that affects us psychologically. So we're always trying to have kind of the most positive behavioral reaction by the environment that we create for other people as architects and as designers. And so that's not something to be ignored, and it's something that can have a huge impact on the users of the building. Often we don't know who the users of the building are going to be. Sometimes we do if it's maybe residential or, it's a more customized facility. But often, especially with public projects, it could be anyone. And so we're trying to have the maximum, most positive impact on, behavior and mood and well-being that is for the good of most people. Often we can have psychological reactions from different, environments. Sometimes those are brought about by shape or size or color or design. This building, it has kind of an optical illusion. The portion in the kind of the colored portion is in the background, and then there's another piece of this that's in the foreground, and so you're kind of trying to decipher what's happening with this structure. Now, there are other things that can have an impact psychological reactions in people. It could be the size of architecture, it could be the color, surfaces, texture, reflectance, light quality. For example, if you're in a room and the room size is, let's say it's about a 10 foot by 10 foot room, you're going to have a different psychological reaction in that room if the ceiling is 30 feet high. You might feel like you're in kind of a silo, or there's something that's supposed to be happening above you, or you might feel like the room is too tall, for example. But if that same room were, 3 feet high and you couldn't sit up, you couldn't stand up in that room, you definitely have a different reaction to that room. You'd feel, perhaps claustrophobic. You'd feel like the ceiling was kind of caving in on you, even if nothing were physically happening other than just the location of the ceiling plane. And so we tend to have psychological reactions to our environment, whether we're aware of that or not. Some of that has to do with our perception. So our perception of architecture can be just as critical as the actual built environment. Now, there are all kinds of things that affect our perception, and sometimes we can't anticipate how people are going to perceive different elements in architecture, but we're always trying to kind of, um, you know, project onto what the user will experience as they're either moving through a space or when they enter a space. What is the light quality? What is the color quality? What is the visual impact that something is going to have on a person or a user of the building? You can think of an example of this with something like a haunted house. And not a truly haunted house, but let's say you're going to visit a haunted house that's put on during Halloween. And often people's perception of what is going to take place there impacts them more than the actual physical space. So perhaps there's darkened rooms and maybe there's, like spooky sounds that are playing, but our perception that something either scary is going to happen or something that is, going to be a surprise impacts us in a way that we might perceive the situation as fearful, and not truly fearful, but maybe for entertainment value, but you're kind of more on edge when if you were to look at the building and maybe if they turned all the lights on, you'd think, oh, this is just a regular room, or maybe this is just like a regular space that I don't know why I was so freaked out about what was going to happen. But if you have the perception that something is either going to take place in a certain room or that it's going to be scary or fearful, then that will definitely color your view of what is actually taking place versus reality. Now, sometimes when we think of this, you might think of where you went to school as a child. And if you go back to that place as an adult, you might think, oh my gosh, this place is really small. And it's because your perception as a child was that everything was bigger than you and that everything was nearly overwhelming size-wise. And when you go back, it's not just that you yourself are actually bigger as an adult, it's just that your perception of things is now in a more level, kind of adult-centric way, and you're able to understand that, things are not intimidating architecturally, or that certain things are not overwhelming, and so you don't maximize the space in your mind that you might do when you're a child. So our perception really can color our view in terms of perceiving architecture. It might change our memories of spaces. This can happen, if you haven't been to a place where you lived many years ago, and you might think that things were either like bigger or smaller or a different color or, whatever it happens to be. And this can be colored in a positive way or a negative way. And so our perception really impacts the memory of architecture, the way we think about certain spaces that we've been in the past, or we might project certain things onto buildings, maybe something that happened in a building that will change our perception of it, when really that building was the same whether or not you thought of that in a certain way, and someone else might have a completely different perception of that particular building. Something else that we look at is illusion. Now, it could be an optical illusion, like in this photograph. This is an artist who does these water spouts that look as if they're floating in midair and then the water is coming out, where in reality the attachment is happening through where the water spout is. But our expectation is that if that spout isn't mounted to something physical, that some magic is taking place, right? And so this idea of illusion in architecture, now this is an art example, but we might incorporate that as designers because people have mental expectations about what buildings are going to be like or what certain features of architecture should or should not exist. And so you can either utilize the concept of illusion to create a certain environment, or you can change people's perception or their behavior in a building. And depending on the use of the building, depending on the function of it, you might kind of use that to your advantage. You might make something seem larger through certain kind of optical tricks or optical features when you don't really have that much space, or you might use it for some other purpose. But the idea of illusion can be something that is intentional by the architect. It can be something that's unintentional and is based on the user's experience of that building or that space. Scale is something that we talk about a lot, and we've talked about it in previous lectures, where scale is really the relationship of architecture to humans. And if you don't have something that you can relate to in terms of, what you're perceiving and, how that makes you feel or how that makes you behave, then it's hard to determine how large something is or the scale of something. So this image that we're looking at, because we don't have anything that references human beings, we don't have somebody's head or their hands, or this could be the size of a whole building, or this could be the size of a 2-inch square looking at some textural piece of a wall or some object. And so scale is really important when we talk about human behavior, because if we don't feel psychologically like we fit as humans in that space, then it makes it hard for us to understand what the function of that space is. And all of these things are probably happening subconsciously. I doubt that every time you walk into a building, you're thinking consciously about architectural determinism and how that space is impacting you in that moment. Now, maybe after this, you will start to consider that and you'll start to think of it. But scale is one of those things that affects our behavior and our perception within a space. Proportion is something that also impacts how we interact with a space. We've talked about this in other lectures, that proportion is the relationship of a building's parts to itself. Do things seem ordered? Do things seem organized? If they're not organized, it can kind of instill a feeling of chaos in us, or maybe unease. Now, that doesn't always impact people for the negative if something is not seeming symmetrical or proportional. But if you look at proportion, oftentimes we're looking at ordered objects or rhythmic objects, and if you have something that has a certain order or repetition or rhythm, you have a psychological expectation of what comes next. And so sometimes if you don't have that, and you're either going to a building for the first time and you might be a little ill at ease, you might have some uneasiness about moving through the space. And again, that could be subconscious, but proportion, sometimes if we have the expectation that things are going to be ordered and it feels that way spatially, then we might be more comfortable moving through that space and interacting with it. Wayfinding is the idea that you are able to find your way, obviously, through a space. Now, that can be through the use of signage or symbols or something telling you where to go. But the idea of wayfinding in architecture is that basically you'll be able to kind of figure out where to use the space or where to use the spaces that you need to without, going and asking for a person to tell you where to go. Sometimes the most successful buildings are the ones where it just seems natural that certain spaces exist within certain parts of the building, or that certain functions take place within certain parts of the building. And, you know, this is kind of a constantly researched and studied topic about how you're able to move people through different spaces. Sometimes we think about signs as just like words on a placard, but if you really think about it, if people perceive things differently depending on their experience, their culture, their language, their gender, then are you biasing your wayfinding or your signage to one particular group? For example, if you have a sign and it's written in a specific language, then your wayfinding is targeted toward, first of all, people who read, people who are reading that particular language. And wayfinding also starts to have an impact on behavior, because if you're unable to utilize the space, if you don't feel like that space is for you, or you're not able to navigate it properly, then you can start to have negative feelings or negative psychological reactions. You might start to get panicked because you don't know where to go. You start to become disoriented. And so all of these issues of wayfinding are very important, and they also need to be considered for people of different ages, people of different experience levels, especially if you're going to have lots of people coming through a space that have never been there before. We use this a lot with airports and train stations and transportation. You're trying to move people through in a specific amount of time who are probably unfamiliar with the space, and so you want the wayfinding to be as easy for people as possible. So we've talked up to this point about psychological reactions to architecture, how architecture impacts our behavior, but there are also physiological reactions that we experience in our environment. Now, those could be as a result of climate, perhaps, temperature, humidity, wind, all other things that might influence us physically. But, architecture definitely has an impact on the way that we feel physically. And so we do talk about that with determinism, because not only is it affecting could our physical reactions affect our behavior, it could also affect, other things psychologically. So it's really hard to separate sometimes the physiological reactions or physical reactions we have to the built environment from the psychological reactions that we have. One thing that we talk about when we're talking about physiological reactions is human comfort. So human comfort has a few different facets that we tend to look at in architecture. One of them can be thermal human comfort. And when we talk about thermal human comfort, it means kind of how hot or how cold you are. But it's not just the temperature. It has to do, in this kind of depiction that we're seeing here, has to do with the relative humidity of a building. It has to do with the air temperature in a room. It could be the radiant temperature outside. Is it a summer condition? Is it a winter condition? And even if we say, well, the thermostat is set to a certain set temperature inside, that doesn't mean that it's going to feel the same all the time. If you're in a cold environment outside and you're coming into a certain temperature, you might have different expectations than if it's a really hot summer day and you come into that same temperature. It's actually going to feel different because your body is becoming accustomed to the season that it's in, the relative humidity that's occurring outside, perhaps the relative humidity that's occurring inside. And so, we look at all these things in relation to our thermal human comfort, also our physical reaction to the environment. That could have to do with the person's size, the person's metabolism, your weight, your kind of physical reactions to things, how hot or cold you tend to be all the time. And so human comfort is definitely an issue that we look at when we're designing environments, and that really goes hand in hand with psychological performance, psychological states of people using the building, especially when we're talking about things where a certain level of kind of achievement or performance is concerned. We don't tend to focus on how we're performing in a building, but there are expectations for human comfort when we're performing a certain task. So let's say we're in an office environment. There are some expectations about how comfortable it will be physically and thermally so that people can do their work. If people are too hot or too cold, or they're sweating profusely, or they feel sick, they're not able to perform their work functions, or they're not able to learn, or they're not able to help other people with the task that they're supposed to do for their job. And so there really are certain conditions that are optimal, and also most of the time they're necessary for people to be able to feel comfortable enough to be able to function. Now this goes for other environments too, like retail environments. People who own businesses know that if people are not physically and thermally comfortable, they're not going to stay in that store and shop. They're not going to spend money at their business. They're trying to make it acoustically comfortable so that it's not too loud, or that's why they try and play pleasant music, even though not everybody likes that. But they're trying to create an atmosphere, both physically and psychologically, that will be most comfortable for people, and most beneficial to them, and most optimal for them to focus on other tasks. So the idea is that you're taking the focus off of, kind of that human survival instinct, kind of that fight or flight instinct. You don't want that to kick in every time you go into a building. You want people to be comfortable and calm physically so that they can focus in on other tasks. Anthropometry is something that we have discussed in previous lectures, but it's basically the study of the measurement of the human body. And the reason why we look at this in terms of behavior and human comfort and architectural determination is because if our environment impacts our behavior, and we're trying to achieve a certain positive outcome in terms of people's behavior, then we want to design and tailor an environment that is customized to humans, right? If humans feel most comfortable physically, then they're going to be able to perform the task that they need to. And so we look at things like, what are the measurements of average people sitting or standing or performing certain functions? How far can people reach with their arms? But even that anthropometry is kind of a biased study, because you're saying, well, this is perhaps what the ideal measurements of a person are, and there just aren't ideal measurements. People are all different shapes and sizes, and people have certain abilities, or they might have certain disabilities. And so we need to keep that in mind so we don't go so far to one side and say, well, this is the kind of ideal average person that probably doesn't exist, but we might favor a certain type of person and kind of disfavor others. So we're trying to have a range of measurements that are comfortable for the most amount of people. Now, ergonomics is related to anthropometry. So if anthropometry is the measurement of humans and studying human measurement and human reach and motion, then ergonomics is talking about the design of a space that is using anthropometry as its influence. So we're talking about designing spaces that are measured to human form, that are measured to human scale. And so, like the image on the left, if we're looking at, where to place light switches or how you're going to interact with this countertop and the, upper cabinets, we want to say, okay, we want it to be something that a person can reach, that if there are things that they're going to use all the time, perhaps those are at eye level. We want the countertop to be at a height that it's comfortable to perform those functions. So when you see like ergonomic chairs or ergonomic door handles or ergonomic computer keyboards, it's things that are designed so that people are most comfortable to be able to use them, so they're not having to strain themselves to use those things. And the image on the right, when we look at where we're placing things, like, this image basically says if you have something in a drawer and somebody doesn't have to crouch down and look, then that is ergonomically more beneficial because you're not going to strain your knees every time. You're not going to have to kind of crouch down and get on the floor basically and look to see what's on that shelf. So the thing on the right is not as ergonomic because we're not designing something in a way that favors human motion or human measurements. And you can actually have the same thing. So it's like if you put that bowl on the right hand side, if you put that in a drawer, you can see that perfectly well, but you don't have to crouch down to do it. You can put it, it's basically like taking that shelf and letting it slide to you instead of you having to crouch down and look back and see what's on the shelf. So you see quite a bit more of that in things like kitchen design, office design, bathroom design, so that you're making it a bit easier for people to use. A lot of times people are not even aware when they use these types of spaces why or how things are easier to use, but they might just say, I really like using this set of drawers or something, and they may not be aware that it's because it's probably a bit easier on them physically to utilize that. You can perform functions more quickly, you can find things more easily, and so ergonomics takes those the information that we get from anthropometry and incorporates that into the design of the space. Proxemics is the study of nonverbal communication. So it really has to do with personal space. I mean, that's kind of what it boils down to. And it has to do with, how comfortable you are with people being in a certain proximity to you. And this is one that is both physical and psychological, because we can say, well, it's physical because, if people are standing a certain distance from you, then, they fall into one of these kind of 4 categories. But it's also psychological because this is definitely a cultural norm, right? This varies from culture to culture. Some cultures are more formal and they're not comfortable with close physical proximity. Some cultures, that's all they're about. That is kind of the standard of the culture, is that people maybe they're in an urban environment even, or that just culturally they talk closely to one another and they're more comfortable with that. So this varies widely from culture to culture. But if we look at this kind of range of spacing, typically we're going to say that, and this is kind of a North American norm, like when we're talking about how people are spaced out. So if someone is within 2 feet of you, it tends to be a more intimate relationship or an intimate form of communication. And that's just nonverbal. So kind of your body language is indicating that's a more intimate connection. Now between about 2 feet and 4 feet, that's what we would refer to as personal space or a personal zone of contact. And it's somebody that you're familiar with, maybe you're friendly with, but you can talk to them and have a one-on-one conversation. And then between about 4 feet away from the person to about 12 feet is considered a social space where people are kind of moving around you. You might say hello to someone, but you're not having like a personal conversation. And then more than 12 feet away from you, there might be people moving around, but that tends to be a more public zone. And so proxemics is really the study of nonverbal communication as it deals with your personal space and the relationship of people as they're spaced either closer to you or farther away from you. Now, proxemics influences architecture in a few different ways. Obviously, it influences people psychologically because, depending on how close or far away people are, that kind of determines the relationship that you have interpersonally. But if you are, looking at, for example, American culture, and we use kind of those 4 rings of the spacing, then it determines your architectural boundaries and the spacing that you need around people's workspace, their living spaces, how they eat, and just how they kind of move around and how much space you dedicate per person to specific functions. And so if we look at this kind of plan diagram in an office, it really influences how you react with others. So the one on the top, that would be considered a more open space, meaning, that person could slide out from their desk and they could be facing each other kind of knees to knees and not have anything between them. And so we tend to think of that as being more open. Some people are more comfortable with that. A closed relationship would be if you have your back to the person and you're not going to turn around. Now, interpersonally, that's a bit weird because you're not making eye contact with somebody and conceivably you'd be wanting to talk to them. But in any situation, a closed relationship is one where there's not that direct link or that direct contact. If we look at the diagram on the bottom, this is a more blocked relationship. And you see this a lot actually in offices where kind of the difference between the one on the top is that you could conceivably move toward the person in the open relationship and be face to face or kind of knees to knees with the person. But the one on the bottom is a more blocked relationship, and this would be more pronounced if the person to the right were on the opposite side of the desk. That would be a more blocked relationship. Now you see this a lot in offices because people might be more comfortable being behind a desk, and that's just like a psychological thing. It makes them feel kind of more protected. This is really common, especially if you have people come into your office all the time that you don't know. Having the desk between you is kind of a psychological and physical barrier, but it's all influenced by proxemics. So like what you're comfortable with, what's culturally acceptable, what's acceptable for that job or your position. And so we study this as a means of determining how big or how small to make things, how big or how small to make certain spaces. Corporate reality, this is just the idea that we have a physical world. And these are a series of photographs that somebody took of people getting wet and kind of experiencing that. So it just means that the idea that we don't live in a virtual world. Like in architecture, a lot of times we'll make these digital models or these computer renderings, and they can look beautiful, but we are making physical buildings for people to inhabit. And so we can't lose sight of the fact that we still have a tangible world that has, weather and thermal conditions and physical and psychological conditions. And so corporate reality just says that people have bodies, and we need to have something that is always reminding us that we live in a real physical world. And so it's kind of the study of the human body, and as it deals with architecture, maintaining the idea that we have physical conditions that need to be addressed.